forwards, backwards, and then there's a laser printer. Laser printer. Okay.
Yep, got it. Okay.
My pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mike Carpenter from the Virginia Department of Agriculture. And with that, I'll let Mike go on.
Well, thank you. You know, we might leave the lights up.
You want them up?
It's that time of day, isn't it?
Let me turn them on the back.
Okay, good. If I was in your spot, I know it'd be a tough part of the day for me. So we'll leave some lights on. That way, if you see your neighbors dozing off, you can poke him in the ribs and remind him of what he's missing.
How's that?
Okay, good. Thank you. Again, Mike Carpenter with the Virginia Department of Agriculture. I've been currently with VDAC's current stint 27 years up in Harrisonburg area, doing a lot of work with the cattle and sheep industries up in that northern part of the state. Some of you know or knew Frank Graves, who is the head of Livestock Marketing Services. He retired this past October, and I've taken that position, so I've now moved up and currently have 2 jobs because we haven't filled my position yet. So we're going to be working on that very soon, we hope. Before that, I worked 3 years in Richmond as a feeder pig marketing agent for the state. So we may have crossed paths a few years ago, some 30 years ago, in fact, if you were selling pigs at Farmville or South Hill or Petersburg or Cortland or some of those other places. So that's sort of my background with VDACs. Currently working, like I say, still out of the Valley area in Harrisonburg, working with their livestock marketing services all over the state. I see a few faces in here of some people that have brought cattle to Radiant, to the sales there. I work that sale quite often, and like I say, see some familiar faces. And we've had some discussions before, so this will be just a continuation, perhaps, of what we've talked about earlier. We're going to talk about understanding these feeder cattle grades today, and a number of you probably are already familiar with this, so pardon me if you know it, that's fine. If you have any questions, we'll get to the end, or if it's a burning question on the way through, feel free to raise your hands and we'll try to address that. Feeder cattle grading, something that we've been doing in Virginia for a long time, about 60 years. We had Virginia specifications years ago, and then USDA decided that because of the diverse populations of cattle, you can see quite a difference in those 2 animals right there. Because of the diverse population, decided it would be a good idea to come up with some uniform standards. Just another shot of some feed lots from a few years ago. And also as another way to describe cattle. You see here in North America we have 70 to 80 beef breeds. Some of those actually crosses, of course, but probably about 15 that are actually used a lot, and of course just a couple of very popular breeds. So the feeder cattle grade standards are used as a common trade language between buyers and sellers. We want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges. They're a tool for pinning cattle at officially graded sales. That's what they're used primarily for here in Virginia. At all our graded sales, we use the USDA feeder cattle grade standards so that similar types go into pins of the same kind for that commingled ownership. They're also used to certify feeder cattle grades for futures contracts, primarily in the western states. Standards are used as a basis for federal state livestock market news reporting. You can tell how old these slides are by the prices here. A little bit different today, isn't it? Fortunately, to the good side. So this makes another common denominator for a basis. If you've ever, I'm sure many of you have looked at the market news reports, and you'll see all the different grades and weight categories for the cattle sold at that sale. So the current standards we have, I remember the standards that were developed in 1979 when I was first working for VDACs, and some of our folks and a fellow by the name of Fred Williams with USDA, who's now retired, were charged with coming up with some new standards. These standards were slightly revised in October 1st, 2000. So feeder cattle determining factors. We have the background of the cattle, what you may know about their background, the color, the amount of belly fill on the cattle, whether or not they have horns, any personal preference, breed or size type, any vaccinations that they have, which today can be a very big value determining factor. In the last year, we've seen, let me go back. The wean vaccinated cattle, going back 3 or 4 years, used to command about a $7 a hundredweight price advantage over the in-barn graded feeder cattle sales. We've seen instances in the last year where sometimes that has widened to as much as $15 a hundredweight for these wean vaccinated, particularly if they're one-owner cattle. There's a group out in Southwest Virginia doing a lot of cooperative marketing together, similar to the way some of you have done in this area, putting some load lots together. But those load lots of vaccinated, wean, preconditioned cattle are really commanding a premium now. The buyers, they may tell you that they don't want to pay for it, but when it comes time to it, when they put the pencil to it and it comes crunch time, they'll pay for the cattle because they now know how much death loss and sickness has been costing them over the years. And they know that these weaned preconditioned cattle are going to have much less problems than a balling calf. Other factors: breed, condition of the flesh of the animal, the frame, the muscling, the sex, and the weight. Also, we have condition, flesh, thriftiness, and weight. These things can change with cattle, so therefore not a sound basis for grade standards. Sex is an inappropriate factor since most feeder cattle are sorted before the sale. Occasionally, there'll be some load lots of cattle that are sold with a few heifers in them, for example, and a set discount on the heifers, but not very often. So the primary considerations for USDA feeder cattle grades are frame, size, and muscle score. On the frame size, and this is on your handout if you want to follow along, it's a little smaller print than this, but it relates to the estimated finished weight of the animal given a certain degree of fatness to grade choice based on skeletal size, height, and length in relation to age. We like to say frame size for age is a saying that we like to use a lot. That given degree of fatness to grade choice, it's generally around a ½ inch of fat for many of your British or British continental type breeds. There are some breeds that require as much as 7 to 8/10 of back fat before a large percentage of those cattle will grade choice. The other consideration about the grade standards are that they were written with the presumption that the cattle would go on feed at 750 pounds for steers and about 650 for heifers. So with these weights that you see here, can you change an animal's genetics? Can you alter his genetic background to cause him to finish at a weight other than this? And the answer is yes. If you take a 500-pound calf, put him on a higher energy ration right off the cow, he's probably going to finish at a little less than his normal estimated frame size. On the other hand, consider many of the programs we have here in Virginia where those cattle are grazed to 8, 9, or sometimes even up 1,000 pounds. Those cattle are going to finish a little bit heavier than their genetic frame size may be because they're extending that life cycle. If they don't go on feed till 1,000 pounds, still going to put on 300 to 400 pounds in the feedlot. Automatically, you would think of them as large, even though we still like to describe them as medium-type cattle. Even though technically they may make the large frame grade, realistically, if they had been handled under normal conditions of going on feed at 750, they would have been that medium frame cattle. So there you have your different estimated finishing weights for steers and heifers. Muscle thickness score, and again, this was what was revised in 2000. Before 2000, we had 3 muscle scores. In 2000, it was changed to 4. Number 1 muscle, moderately thick. You can see a pretty good beef type animal there. Number 2 tends to be slightly thick. And that's a pretty good number 2. That's probably midpoint or so. Many of our number 2 cattle will have a slightly less indication of muscling than that. Number 3, thin muscled. A lot of your dairy breeds fall into this. And number 4, again, some of your dairy breeds like a Jersey, many of the Longhorns. Some beef cattle will be graded a 4 if they've experienced some malnutrition, possibly 3 or 4. We'll get into some more scenarios in just a minute. Anyway, muscle thickness relates to muscle to bone ratio at a given degree of fatness, and hence the yield grade. One thing that's not discussed in these slides, but to talk about yield grade just a minute, the finished animal, the yield grades are 1 to 5, with 3 being an average. If you compare a heavy muscled animal to a light muscled animal, you can change the yield grade scores. For example, from a 2, an animal like this would more likely have a yield grade 2 with a ½ inch of fat. This animal is probably going to be a yield grade 4 or 5 with a ½ inch of fat, just because of the muscle to bone and muscle to fat ratio in that animal. Frame size, large, medium, and small, and you have some pictures there to go by also. Large frame steers, tall and long bodied, ½ inch of fat at over 1,250 pounds, heifers at over 1,150 pounds. And you'll see this somewhat of a continental cross. Many of our continental cross, Charolais, Simmental, Gelbvieh, a lot of those type breeds will be large frame. Medium size, more of your British breeds or British continental cross. Slightly tall and long bodied, ½ inch of fat steers, 11 to 1250. Heifers, 1,000 to 1,150. And small frames, not as tall as the medium. Short bodied, ½ inch of fat, steers less than 1,000 pounds. Just a couple pictures of some large, medium. Even though the animal on the left, and I don't have the narrative, there was not a narrative provided with these slides. This animal on the left, he's smaller than the rest of them, but he's got some characteristics about him. He may not be as small frame as you think. Another example, 2 larges and a medium or small frame. Large white, medium black, small red. Large black, small white, medium red. One thing we'll get to in a minute, I want you to notice this animal on the right. He's taller at the shoulders than he is at the hips. One thing that's one of the indicators we look at when trying to determine frame size for age. In general, younger animals will be taller at the hip area than they are in the front. This one is getting, you see, proportionally a lot deeper up in the front part of his body, more like a buffalo, and generally cattle develop that way as they age. You know, your older beef type cows and dairy cows, they'll be much deeper in the front part of their bodies than they will be, or stand taller at the shoulders than they do at the hips. So frame size relative to maturity, some of the maturity indicators we look for. Length of tail, you know, if it's a short tail up above the hock, he's still a calf, still very young. If it's midpoint, just below the hock, a little older, maybe a yearling, and if they're approaching 2 or 2.5 years old, sometimes those tails can almost be dragging the ground. Width of the muzzle is another indicator. Coarseness of hair on the poll, size of the feet, ears, and the base of the horns. One thing to try to get you to understand maturity about how the animals develop, and it also relates to marbling. When an animal is provided nutrition, they have built into their systems a certain priority that nutrition goes for. In other words, the first thing that's satisfied are brain and nervous systems. That's why some animals, no matter what their age, they'll have a large head. So at some point they may have been deprived of nutrition, but that head, brain, and nervous system is still going to grow. Next priority is skeletal system. Next priority is some of the internal organs and fat surrounding those internal organs. Next is muscle development, and I'm progressing in steps. In other words, the more feed you give the animal, the quicker they will develop these parts of the body. So we have muscle development. Next comes exterior fat deposits, and the last fat to be deposited is the intramuscular or marbling fat. That for the choice grade of cattle, for what a large part of our industry here in the United States, that's what's desired, that choice animal. So that's the reason for finishing cattle, you need to give them a lot of energy, because energy is what produces the exterior fat and that marbling fat as well. Jorgensen's muscling theory. Phil Jorgensen was a USDA market news reporter in the western part of the U.S., helped develop these feeder cattle grade standards, and he came up with this theory that we use today, and it's really pretty basic. But in trying to get people to understand a little bit more the differences of evaluating muscle, he came up with this theory, and again, very basic. Roundness will indicate heavy muscling or lean type animal. In this case, it would be a heavy muscled and lean. Triangular shapes, generally, and I'm thinking about if you visualize the rear end of an animal when viewed from the rear or from the side. If it's triangular shape, he's going to be wider at the hips and very narrow down at his hocks, to the point that sometimes those cattle's feet, when they walk, they'll almost be rubbing together. Slide to the right is of a very fat, almost obese animal. So his theory is on these heavy muscle cattle that you have heavy muscling. If viewed from the rear, that animal develops a square appearance. It means he's tending to get fat. As animals deposit fat, they'll fill in the box, so to speak, to the point they become almost a square. Now again, this would be maybe an obese animal, but in general, the squarer the appearance of the animal, the more fat they have on their exterior of their body. If you take this animal and finish it to this point, to the point that it's filled in fat all the way down here, you'll see there's a lot more fat in this picture. If pink indicates fat, there's a lot more fat on this animal, and thus that's where you get your yield grade difference for those two different animals.
Animal is better for getting to finish the choice then?
That's another subject. Lighter muscled animals, now this is exterior fat.
Right. Okay.
Around the edges. The other thing about muscle types, heavy muscled animals, generally it takes more feed to get them to grade choice, higher degree of energy. Lighter muscled animals like dairy animals tend to, or will finish, will grade choice with a lesser amount of fat. So given that, what breed of dairy cattle are going to be some of the easiest to grade choice? Jerseys. A lot of Jerseys will grade choice on grass if you have a really flush, really good crop of grass. Whereas a heavy muscled animal, something like perhaps a Charolais or Simmental, there'd be far less of those type animals that would finish on grass.
So which ones do best on grass finishing? The British breeds or the little...
What's your desired end product? Do you want lean muscle or do you want choice grade? You want both, someone said? A little bit of both. You probably want a moderately framed, moderately muscled animal. You probably wouldn't want an extremely heavy muscled animal, something that would tend to be double muscled probably. You probably want to stay away from that. An animal like this is going to have a much higher percentage of lean. So if you want a little bit of both, pick a moderate frame, average muscle type animal to finish.
So like your Angus and your Herefords?
Sure. Most of them. There are exceptions. That's the thing. In every breed, we've seen frame size and muscle scores almost of every color. In other words, we've seen black cattle, large, medium, and small. We've seen black cattle with 1, 2, 3, or 4 muscle scores. Going for moderation is really what you're after in both of those aspects.
Could I finish a little bit easier to choice on a grass-fed program?
Yes, you could. You would sacrifice some muscle. Keep that in mind, and you wouldn't want to try to over-finish that animal because they're going to finish at a lesser amount. For example, the Jersey steer, I mentioned earlier, a ½ inch of fatness on the beef cattle. Jersey and even Holsteins can grade choice with 0.2 to 2/2500. About half the amount of exterior fat. It's the nature of the beast. It's the way they were created. But research has proven that. And not only Jersey, but perhaps some other light muscle type breed would also may give you the same desired effect. There are some breeds who are known for producing choice quality on grass. I think of, I was at the Forage and Grassland meeting a few years ago in Culpeper. Was it Randy Owen from Alabama was there? And talked about the types of cattle they have to finish on grass. He has some certain Angus genetics or certain Red Devon genetics. If that's what you're going to focus on, do some research because there are breeds that will or do have a history of proving that they will grade quicker on grass. And that's the other thing. You see some people that just want to produce grass-fed beef, with the cattle they have, and the production system may not fit. There are exceptions. Another conference in Stanton a few years ago, there was a gentleman there from North Carolina who produced pretty good quality grass-fed beef with Charolais cattle. But he was a grass producer first. He had pictures of the most lush grass I've ever seen. He had done his homework. He knew what grasses to produce so that he could produce the end product that he was looking for. Here's a rear view of animals of those muscle scores again. Pretty basic, thickest to lightest muscle. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this animal, when finished, will have a more desirable yield grade closer to a 1, with 1 being the leanest. And this one, with the same amount of fat, would be much higher in fat to muscle ratio. So number one, muscle thickness, moderately thick throughout with predominant beef breeding. Number two, slightly thick throughout, high proportion of beef. Could be some dairy breeding there as well. Number three, muscles thin throughout, legs sit closer together. I mentioned that earlier. You see, here's a good example. Remember Jorgensen's theory? See the roundness when viewed from the side, particularly here where that muscle protrudes to the rear of the animal. When viewed from the side, the quarters are the thickest part of that animal. Compare that to a number three. See the triangular shape from here to here and down to here? Thicker up here than down here. Number four is less than a number three, of course. Here's some examples of what I would say are a number one, a number two, and a number four. Very light muscled animal here. See those, high tail head, narrow hips, very narrow pin bones, and very light muscling here in the quarter.
So why would you say the white there was a number two instead of a number one?
He may be. The picture can be a little deceiving. To my eye, he doesn't have quite the expression of muscling down through here compared to this animal. See how this one carries muscle all the way down to this level? He starts to peter out right in here just a little bit to me. He's got maybe a little higher tail head set. He could be a minimum for a number one. If we could see that animal move around a little bit, best case scenario, you like to see him moving so that you can see some of the stifle expression of muscling. And then there's inferior cattle that are mismanaged or have a disease problem, or there's parasitism. Any condition that must be corrected before the animal can perform normally. Another thing that can change the grades of feeder cattle grades, particularly muscle scores, are any of these things right here. If they don't have enough feed to express all of that muscle development, if they've been sick to the point that they lose weight, that can affect muscle development. Parasitism affects their nutritional intake, nutritional utilization, and of course can prevent them from expressing all of their genetic potential. And some people will buy these cattle, give them proper management, get them straightened out, get them over their sickness or their whatever it is, maybe feed them a little bit better. And they're some of the number 3 muscle cattle, if they've been mismanaged, you can take those cattle and make a number 2 or sometimes maybe even a number 1 muscle out of them, if they've truly been mismanaged and it's not all genetic. So inferior is any condition that needs to be corrected, but also double-muscled animals. That critter's in pretty poor shape. That's about as poor as an inferior as you want to see. We can, an inferior can be much less severe than that. Here's a picture of a double-muscled animal. We don't have too many of those here in the United States, more in the European breeds. See the ripples and the muscle, just like a bodybuilder, or like cattle on extreme steroids. But you can't give typical cattle enough steroids to cause muscle development like this. This is his genetics. These animals will tend to never grade choice because their genetic disposition is to produce lean meat and muscle, not marbling. And when you see ripples in the quarter and even on the sides and the front quarters of an animal like that, they'll deposit very little, if any, exterior fat, even if fed a high-energy diet. It's their genetics. A couple of more pictures of different muscle cattle. So again, the standards are a communication tool. We use the USDA Grade Plus weight and sex information, any comments about personal preferences, condition, flesh, breed characteristics, and of course I mentioned earlier, special sales, pre-vaccinated, wean, preconditioned sales, and the effect that can have on value of cattle. On your handout, I want to highlight, I've mentioned it a couple times, but want to highlight it again. Second paragraph, the last sentence. The feeder cattle grade standards continue to be based on evaluating differences in frame size and muscle thickness. Two of the most important genetic factors, I want you to underline genetic factors affecting value in feeder cattle. If some of your cattle grade small frame, it's most likely the genetics. It's not you. So don't take it personal when we grade your cattle in S. If you want to change that animal, you've got to change the genetics. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are times when you can alter slightly the predicted finished weight of an animal, but most of it is genetics, particularly on frame size and also on muscle score if you limit the amount of feed intake that animal may be taking in. Any questions? Thank you. Hope to see you around and good luck to you.